Thank you very much. When I was invited, I wasn't quite sure what I should talk about. First, I thought talk about facial feedback, but then it was not that suitable for this conference. And I was reminded that some years ago we have done some research that is more closely related to the topic of this conference, namely research on anchoring, and we have embedded this research in a broader perspective of information processing, also into a model that we have recently developed. So I guess I'm not a legal expert, but as a social psychologist, I'm interested in judgments, and I guess that I'm not a judge, but interested in judgments. Now, there may be some points where we have it's possible to talk to each other. And the goal of my lecture is to provide a more general understanding of judgment generation, partly directly related to legal judgments, but also pointing out some more general findings and some general mechanisms that are useful for judgment generation in legal contexts. I'm not interested, of course I'm interested in biases. I'm interested how judgments deviate from where we want them to go, from the criteria that we set up for ourselves. But I'm not interested, and I say that at the very beginning, in kind of motivational influences. I'm not interested if people distort their judgments because they want to increase their self-esteem and they devalue somebody else. Or in the legal domain, I'm not interested if the judgment has the purpose of general prevention, right? Then this is not my topic. I'm interested in situations where people try to optimize accuracy. Yeah? And for the economists of you notice I'm not saying maximize, I'm saying optimize, because there are other goals that go with it. For example, the goal of speed, right? So we typically are in situations where we don't have all the time we would need to generate a judgment, or we do not want to invest the effort that we would have to invest to maximize accuracy. So this is something that we have to keep in mind. But let's assume you are your main goal, your primary goal is accuracy, and for a very long time, judgment researchers thought this is the way judgments are being generated in a systematic fashion, and biases are mainly due to social desirability and motivational influences, until Tversky and Kahneman came along, and they acknowledged that judgments are typically done under uncertainty. So there are situations where most of the judgment situations are situations in which complete accuracy cannot be achieved. There will always be some uncertainty being left. And they were very constructive about it, and they said, well, in those situations, we have to simplify our judgment. We have to simplify our judgments, and the way we simplify our judgments is by using heuristics. So heuristics, as you may know, are shortcuts in judgments. And these shortcuts are mainly generated by substituting the basis of the judgment, making it easier by finding a judgmental basis that takes less effort, less time, and so on to generate the outcome. So it's substitution is the basic secret of heuristics. Okay, so the substitution making it simpler may also be a way in which complicated legal judgments may be adjusted to the situations in which they have to be generated. One famous classical experiment is consider the letter K. Is K more likely to appear in the first position of the word or the third position of the word? Well, how would you go about if you would maximize accuracy? You may either kind of look through all the dictionaries for all the words that are there, or you engage in an exhaustive search of your memory, which probably takes some time, certainly not about the 2 minutes that you're being given to answer this question. So what do you do instead? You know, you simplify it. You simplify it by substituting. And what do you substitute this extensive search by? So you take the ease with which the word comes into your mind, right? So if some words come to mind very easily, then you say they are frequent, and if it's kind of difficult to generate, and it's less frequent. That's not a bad way to go, because psychologically that's kind of valid, because more frequent exposure, frequency, leads to easier recall. Yeah? So for about 90% of the cases, the error rate would be not very high. It's a kind of an easy way to go. But if other cues are more effective, for example, the first letter as a search cue in memory, that may overrule the heuristic, and then you may make a mistake. So that's I think the very first example of the so-called availability heuristic, where judgments are substituted. Okay, so here is another example. I mean, we have to very often this judgments that you have to make are more categorical judgments. For example, guilty, not guilty, something like that. And that's also a difficult judgment. And you may have to simplify under certain conditions. And there's also a very nice example that Tversky and Kahneman talked about, the Linda paradigm. So Linda has to be categorized. It's a categorization task. The task is Linda a bank teller, or is Linda a bank teller and active in the feminist movement? You know, and I just read the text very shortly. Linda, the description of Linda. She's 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with the issue of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. So, is Linda a bank teller? Is Linda a bank teller and active in the feminist movement? Well, I mean, we don't know. This is uncertainty. So we have to kind of find a way to reach a judgment. And what people did is they thought, well, 2 is more likely than 1, right? But of course, this is a mistake. This is a mistake because 2 is a subset of 1 and can therefore not be more likely. But what has the judgment been based off? What is kind of the substitute for more kind of complex and complicated calculations? It's the similarity, the kind of what they call representativeness. It fits. It's a fit that the description fits more a bank teller and a feminist activist, then it's just a bank teller. So it's a kind of a fitting of prototypes, and the similarity becomes the basis of the judgment and simplifies the judgment. Okay, so Tversky and Kahneman's approach is really very important to be aware that we have to adjust our judgments to the situations, to the possibilities we have in the situations, that we simplify the judgments, and we have to look how they are being simplified. Okay, but we came from a little bit different direction. I'm a social psychologist, but to be more precise, I'm a social cognition person. Social cognition means information processing in a social context. So we're interested in how the cognitive processes with a time dimension, how they are going on over time. And we have, and that's Roland Deutsch and I, we have come up with a model. It's called reflective impulsive model. It's even more complicated than that. But don't worry, I'm not getting into all the details. But it has the goal to link, you may have heard about explicit, implicit processes, automatic control processes. That has typically been applied either to judgments or to behavior. And the goal of this model was to link judgment and behavior in its explicit and implicit components. We call it reflective and impulsive component, right? So, and then you can talk about temptation, all kinds of things. Of course, you can talk about stereotyping also, but also kind of behavioral consequences that may either be the consequence of the anticipated outcome, which is kind of the rational economic way of explaining behavior, or it may be the consequence of a kind of an associative link, like a habit. I'm not thinking what I'm doing with my hand, this is just happening automatically, or of an emotion, yeah? So we have, for example, action tendencies that go with specific emotions, fight, flight, but also we argue together with others that there's also an automatic approach avoidance tendency that's associated with kind of positive and negative emotions. Okay, so within this model, we have looked at a phenomenon, and I'll be more specific about it, which is called anchoring. Anchoring was also a heuristic. In the early version of Kahneman's, later not, he said, no, it's not a heuristic, and I agree. It's not a simplification, it's simply a bias, But we wanted to understand it within a more kind of overarching model of information processing. So I'm shortly talk a little bit about information processing and what's important there, and then I'll be more concrete. So I start with the standard sequence of information processing. So this is like, doesn't tell you apart from a behaviorist, right? So this is stimulus and response. Stimulus and response are the elements that are kind of observable, yeah? But a behaviorist would say that that everything that's in between cannot be scientifically studied. Cognitive psychologists and social cognition people say that's what's really important. If we want to understand the relation between stimulus and response, we have to understand what's happening in between, right? And there are a couple of things that are happening in between. For example, the stimulus must be encoded. It must be encoded. A mental representation has to be generated. It has to be retrieved from memory. This is an idealized temporal order. And then there are also cognitive operations that are happening. I'm focusing more on encoding. So, for example, if I am exposed to this object over there, I can encode it as a chair, And this sounds trivial, but it has enormous consequences. I don't need to have any experience with this object. I know that I can sit on it. I know that I can lift it. All kinds of things that are not based on my experience, but on my knowledge that I have stored and that can be transmitted because it has been encoded, right? So And that's also relevant when we talk about people, right? So we categorize people as belonging to a certain to a certain group, right? And the knowledge, quote unquote knowledge, sometimes it's the knowledge is not very valid and it may be distorted, motivationally distorted. The knowledge, quote unquote, about the group is applied to the individual. That's called stereotyping, but it's an act of categorization, right? We don't need to have any experience with that person, you know. I mean, the fact that, you know, with immigrants, you know, it's not necessary to have an experience with immigrants. You have your opinion about it, and sometimes these opinions are even stronger than if you have experience with people. Okay, but the category, the use of the category depends that first, that your category is somewhere stored in your long-term memory, in your semantic store. This is the condition number one. But there is a second condition that's equally important and perhaps even more important. It has to be accessible. It has to be accessible in the situation. Yeah, it has to be retrievable in this situation. Most of the time, it's the stimulus, you know, that elicits very clearly the appropriate category. But very often, the stimulus is ambiguous, and it's not clear which category is applicable to the stimulus. And this is particularly the case when it comes to people. Yeah? It's not very clear. I mean, there are so many categories I could put you in if I wanted to, you know. But how I do it depends to a large degree to what comes to my mind. And now the question is, what determines what comes to mind? And it's very important. And there's another classic study by Torrey Higgins and his colleagues. Torrey Higgins from Columbia University now, category accessibility and impression formation. He gave people a description of a guy called Donald, and this guy Donald did a couple of things, and they were, you know, described as being ambiguous. So, for example, he's described as Donald was aware of his ability to do many things well. So you could say, well, this is self-confident, but also you can say this is somewhat conceited, right? Or he said, well, Donald rarely changed his mind when it might have well been better if he had. Then you can say this is persistent, which is kind of more positive, or stubborn, which is kind of a more negative description of this behavior. So this was the description that people got. They had to evaluate, describe Donald, how they saw it, but there was an experimental manipulation. The experimental manipulation was in a preceding experiment that was meant to be completely unrelated to the Donald experiment. It was on perception, and they got some words, they got pictures, and then they said, well, I mean, in between we have some words, that's just to clear your imagery, you know, and these words were either words, you know, and if you see then, it says applicable positive and applicable negative. The other words like adventurous, self-confident, independent, and so on, or reckless, conceited, aloof, stubborn, which would apply to Donald, a negative, but there are also, and that's very interesting and important, also positive and negative words that did not apply. They could not be used to categorize Donald, you know, but they were positive and negative. For example, obedient, neat, satirical, disrespectful, nothing to do with Donald. Okay, so what the result was, the very first result. So it only applies to applicable adjectives. He was described more positively when the applicable positive words had been activated before and therefore became more accessible subsequently in a completely unrelated task, right? Then if they if they were negative, but it does not apply to inapplicable words, right? I'm always, and that's very interesting because you're not aware that you're being influenced, right? You're not aware that you're being influenced. You say, and if you ask people, yeah, have you been influenced? They say, no, of course not. Why not? Because there is a difference between our episodic memory, which is a very limited memory span, and that's the first, when you get older, that's the first that you're losing. You say, where did I put this stuff, you know? But the semantic memory is much better, you know? So the activation of the concept is still there, but you don't know where you've heard it last. You know? I always give the example, if you write an essay, I mean, that's at least my experience, it's not yours, tell me, and you write an essay, and then you read what you've written again. I am very often surprised that I'm repeating a word over and over again. That's not a kind of a common word, you know. And in the end, I might have corrected, you know. But I should have corrected immediately because I had used it before, right? So my explanation of this phenomenon is that the prior use of this category activates it, but there's no episodic trace that you could say, hey, I've used it before, I shouldn't use it again, right? So a little bit in a completely different domain, that's about the same what's happening here. This is the standard interpretation within the context of information processing. Within our model, yeah, we go a little bit further. We propose, and now it's very simplified, we propose that there are two systems, a reflective system and an impulsive associative system. The reflective system, and maybe there are some neurological correlates for that, is kind of reasoning, prefrontal cortex or whatever, reasoning, drawing inferences, negating also is something that's happening there. It takes attention, it requires attention, it takes more effort, right? And you are easily distracted. Yeah? So if you use a secondary task that's normally used to distract people, you see that this type of these type of processes are affected, but what's not affected are the kind of associative, impulsive processes where links, simple links, associative links are kind of generating, one generates the other. This may happen on the motor level, you know, that's a movement of my hand or my legs or whatever, which is kind of automatized. And it may also happen at the cognitive level if something comes to my mind easily. I don't know where it comes from. Okay, so, but these two systems, they cooperate, and that's very, very important. So because, I mean, we assume that the memory is associative memory. If I draw an inference, I say, what kind of person is that, you know? I draw an inference, if then, in kind of syllogistic reasoning, I need information. This information comes from the associative store, okay? So I retrieve it from the associative store, but not without consequences, because once I've retrieved it, it's more accessible. It's like on the top of the heap. If something is on the top of the heap, and you search from the top to the bottom, of course, you meet the first, what's on the top, and that's what's happening. And therefore, the reflective and the associative mechanisms, they collaborate, you know, in a sense that's very difficult to control. And this idea we have applied to the phenomenon of anchoring. And so anchoring is has originally been introduced as a heuristic by Tversky and Kahneman. In his book he says no, and he's right. And the idea of anchoring is that if you are being exposed to a value and you have to generate a comparative judgment, then the subsequent absolute judgment is being influenced. So, for example, if you're you know, if you're being asked, is the average price of a German car more or less than $100,000? One half of the participants, between participants, or higher or lower than $20,000? then you say, if you are in the 20,000 condition, then you say higher, this is too low. If you are in the 100,000, then say less, it's too high, you know. And then, and that's the explanation that Tversky and Kahneman have offered. You adjust the value when you generate the absolute value. You adjust, because you know it's too high, this value, or it's too low, and you adjust it, but this adjustment is insufficient. Yeah? So the people who've seen the 100,000, they say, oh, it's 60,000, and the one they see 20,000, and they say, oh, it's 35,000. Yeah. Okay, so there is a very robust phenomenon, by the way. This is a phenomenon that's always been, you can show it wherever. And so anchoring adjustment is their explanation. And we thought, no, I mean, let's embed that. That's too superficial, maybe sound too negative, but it's not kind of integrated into an information processing theory, you know, kind of paradigm. And so we thought, okay, this is the, within the RIM, it would, reflective impulsive model, it would look like this. You have two judgment tasks, one after the other. The first one is a judgment task where you generate a comparative judgment, you retrieve this information, and then the absolute judgment task is kind of based on this, on this retrieval. And this is a little bit closer focused on the more kind of micro model of selective accessibility. Now, we know from other research that answering a comparative question is a little bit like testing a single hypothesis. So it's a, is the price of a German car $100,000? Yeah? And then you say no. This is a hypothesis, you say no, and you qualify your response by saying no, less. Right? And we know that testing single hypothesis, what you do, you generate information that's consistent with it. Yeah? It's not that you approve this information all the time, but say, is this possible? You know? And then you generate information that is, generates this possibility, and in the end you negate it. But it's still being generated. It's still being generated, and therefore more accessible for subsequent judgments. This is the model. So you have a test of a hypothesis with a standard, you know, and then selective accessibility of knowledge that's consistent with this standard. Yeah? So is it possible, you know? And then that increases the accessibility. This was a selective accessibility model, and also not only does it kind of integrate the phenomenon into a more kind of superordinate information processing paradigm, it also allows some predictions that would not be predicted by the anchoring and adjustment model. For example, if you change the dimension, right? So if it's only the number and you adjust it, it shouldn't matter on which dimension the judgment takes place. So we thought, it was Cologne Cathedral was the anchoring judgment. We asked, is it higher or less high than 320 or 60 meters? We made sure that the one would say, no, it's less high, and so on. And then later on we asked them, how high is Cologne Cathedral? This is the same dimension. Or we say, how long is Cologne Cathedral? We'd assume that for the anchoring adjustment thing, it wouldn't make much of a difference. And what we found is, oops, here we go. What you see, it's the same dimension. The difference is much higher. I mean, there is a correlation between length and height, so it's not really surprising that it's also a little bit of an effect in the different dimension, but it's much smaller, and that's what we have expected. Okay. It's very important, by the way, just as an aside, that in the yeah, I'll come to it. I'll come to it later. It becomes relevant when we talk about it. Okay, so this is the first prediction about changing dimensions. Okay, the second one was about time pressure. He said, well, if it really depends how much time you have to generate the information, then a subsequent judgment should be shorter, right? there should be a shorter response time for subsequent judgments. And that shouldn't matter for anchoring and adjustment, and that's what we found. The absolute judgment was influenced, the response latencies of the absolute judgments was influenced whether people in the comparative judgment were put under time pressure or not time pressure, so in a reverse way. And finally, lexical decisions. You know, lexical decisions, this is a way of testing the accessibility of categories by asking people, give them strings of letters, non-words. I mean, that's important because they can be pronounced like letters. It's with consonant and vowel, but they're not words. And your task is to say is a word or not a word, yeah? Word, yes, no, but and I mean, everybody can do it. It's not a difficult task. What's really interesting is the response latency, how fast you can do it, yeah? So if it's very accessible, then you can do it very fast, and if you first have to think about it, you know, that's the procedure of the lexical decision task. And we did pretty much the experiment that was described in the cartoon. So we gave them the high anchor or the low anchor, and then we later gave them words that were related to expensive cars and not so expensive cars, you know, related to, and we found they were faster in saying this is a word. Yeah, this is a word, which means it has been activated. And that's also, it's not something that Tversky and Kahneman would have predicted. Okay, here's the result. Now, so how does that, of course, relate to anchors in quad, finally? We said, well, I mean, we liked, and I have to mention, Thomas Musweiler was one of the co-authors in this legal thing. Bert Englich was a collaborator. Her father was a judge. Before she came to us, she was at the university where, you know, what's the name? Referendare, in Germany. I mean, after the first exam, between the bar exam, and she taught at the university where these Referendare, they had a legal training, but she was also giving courses in Trier. There is a legal academy for judges, you know, and she was giving courses and did experiments with these people and to demonstrate the influence. So we were really lucky to have a population. They were not students, not psychology students, you know, so psychology is the science of psychology students, no. I mean, these were really either Referendare or they were judges, sometimes with 15 years experience. I mean, really experienced judges. And the question is, well, if you are really trained to generate judgments that are not biased or kind of in favor of dubio pro reo, in favor of the defendant or something, then maybe you should be less influenced by all these factors. But what we particularly liked is that for some of the judgments, they were nicely scalable. So if you say how many months in prison, you know, or damages awarded, whatever. So we started to do a couple of studies in which we applied that, but on the basis that the generation of kind of anchor consistent information that then influences the judgment. So we had two scenarios we worked with. One is a rape scenario. It was very competently generated with the help of lawyers, psychologists, and so on. So with legal experts and the judges that we used, they got the penal code and all the information they needed. So it was a judgment. It was a situation in which they could get all the information they would need or ask for them. Okay, so the first experiment, they get this rape case, was pre-rated about 17 months in prison was the average rating, and they were told that the prosecutor's demand was either half of the subjects 2 months or 34 months. And they were asked, is this sentence too low or too high, right? And again, they said too, you know, the whole spiel. Okay, so now this was the result. I mean, the typical anchoring effect in this very first study. This was kind of encouraging, right, to pursue this work any further. But if you do the anchoring work, now coming back to something I had mentioned before, in original studies, the experimenter gave the anchor, you know, and that's sometimes a little problematic, because this could be a persuasive communication. And if I'm a responsible communicator, you know, if I'm asking you, am I older or younger than 20, right? And then you say older, and I say, well, I'm 60, I'm 67, there's something wrong, right? But if normally, if a communicator, responsible communicator would not ask you a question that would be very far away. That doesn't make sense. It's not collaborative in a communication. And therefore, you could also say, well, this is not an anchoring effect. This is a communication effect. It's a persuasive communication that's happening. And that's a different mechanism. It's not that this is not working. This is just a different mechanism. Okay. So we thought, well, I mean, maybe it was the competence of the prosecutor that was kind of used as a basis, and they kind of believe if he says that, then there may be a reason for it, and so on. But this is not in our model, you know. In our model, we don't say this is a persuasive communication or competence. It's the mere activation of this information that does the trick. So we did the second study, in which we had, in which the proposed months in prison, the number of months in prison was proposed by a first-year computer science student. So it was supposed to be a student who's not stupid, but kind of not a legal expert. So that was why he was a computer science student, you know. And anyway, so, and that's what we got. So again, and not even, I mean, you look, I mean, in one condition it was a prosecutor, in one condition it was the student. There's no difference, right? So it's really okay. So in the third study, we went a step further. We told the participants that that we are doing a study in which we are kind of interested in the order of something, and for this purpose, the prosecutor's proposal was randomly determined. Yeah. So, but your task is to say, is it too high or too low? But it was randomly determined, and what you see here again. So, not the competence. It's just that I'm inducing you to think in a certain way about this possibility. You know, you don't have to believe that this is and the final study was even the most radical study. So we thought, well, we make it really visible, and we have here we have changed the paradigm a little bit. It was a shoplifting study, a woman who was shoplifting 12 times, and also ambiguous enough. But other than that, it was pretty much the same. Here we had people roll dice, right? So we say, well, it has been randomly generated. You randomly generate them, and we had dice that were kind of prepared in a way that it either was 1 and 2 or 6 and 3, 2 dice. And so it was always a kind of 3 months or 9 months, right? And that was, I mean, really randomly generated. And again, the effect was very clear that the high anchor led to a higher judgment than the low anchor. It's a very, I mean, as I said, a very powerful effect. It's powerful also because it's difficult to correct. Yeah, it's difficult to correct. You're not, if you ask somebody, are you being influenced? No. I mean, if you ask them, is the information relevant? No, right? I'm not influenced because I've said it's too low, right? I mean, I even have done something to, you know, it's counteracted it, you know. And it's difficult to do something against, right? And we always thought about what can we do systematically to show what people, that there's something that people can do. And we have one study, not from the domain of anchoring, but the domain of selling cars. We had a guy, a master student, who had an old car, and he went to all kinds of car dealers, you know, 60 car dealers, and he said, you know, I thought this car would sell for either, it was in German marks time, 2,800 or 5,000 marks. Do you think it's too high or too low? And no question about it, it had an effect on the offer, so keep that in mind. And but he also had a different manipulation. He said, well, a friend of mine mentioned yesterday that he thought this price was too high or too low, so kind of a counteracting. So get people to think about a different possibility, you know. And indeed, it's not very encouraging, but it was somewhat reduced, the effect. It was somewhat reduced if you consider the opposite, right? So anyway, but what are possible, we've been thinking about possible applications to the court situation. Local advice doesn't help very much. But we thought there might be a structural element in a criminal trial, at least, that may not be as effective as the procedural law kind of assumes. And this is the phenomenon, the idea of the last word in court. So if you think you're right, I mean, in a sense of recency, right? Memory, the things that you've heard more recently are more likely to come in mind than the things that you've heard some time ago. So therefore, if you think that there might be a bias, and the idea is if there is a bias, it should be in favor of the defendant, in dubio pro reo, then there's some reason to believe that frequency, that recency, last word in court has some effect. But our findings suggest no. And that's perhaps too fast. There are some reasons that suggest that the first word in court may be more effective, right? So we have some evidence where people have to play prosecutor and defense attorney, and we find that if they play defense attorney, they are, and later being onwards a just fair judgment, you know, and they show the same effect, right? If the prosecutor first proposes a high or a low. And if you have a judge later on being played, being influenced, you find that this is being, that the proposal of the prosecutor, who is first, is being conveyed to the judge via the defense attorney. Yeah? And so I think at least there is kind of reason to think again about this procedural measure that's meant to be in favor of the defendant, and think about the possibility that earlier proposals have an impact that's kind of enduring. And of course it's being remembered better, you know, but it depends on what is being remembered. And that's what I want to convey. And this is my last word, not in court, but in this lecture. And so I thank you for your attention.